Hello, I'm Miss Kilburn Bond, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about the poem London by William Blake. It'd be really helpful if you had a copy of the poem in front of you as we go through it, and some pens, highlighters, that sort of thing, so you can annotate your poem and make any notes that are helpful. So if you need to pause and go and get those things, then do so now. The learning objectives, the aims of this video, are to help you, first of all, to read and understand the feelings, the attitudes that are expressed by William Blake in this poem London, and that ticks the assessment objective 1 box when we're thinking in terms of an exam. We're also going to look at how you can explore and analyse the effect of language, form and structure in the poem, AO2. And then finally, but really importantly in this poem, we're going to spend some time considering how cultural factors help us understand the poet's intentions and the poem's meaning. So what can we find out about William Blake the person? What can we find out about his personal political views and how that might help us understand why he wrote this poem? And also a little bit about what was happening in London at the time that he was writing, and how that's also going to help us see why this poem is so powerful. So let's start then with looking at some paintings here from London at the time in which this poem was written, and that was in the 1790s. So, those of you with lots of general knowledge or a really good understanding of history, you might already have realised that this is the time of the Industrial Revolution. So the city of London would have been well underway in terms of having this great industrial growth. So that means that geographically, physically, the city would have been changing, it would have been growing, and there would have been a lot more industrial buildings being built, and that changed the environment, the atmosphere, and it also changed the way that people lived. It was a time where there was great poverty, where the working classes were suffering, and you can see that in some of these paintings on the screen now, but it was also a time of great wealth. So if we think about what you might know about the British Empire, globally, Britain was seen as this very successful, powerful country, and that's certainly the image that London would have wanted to show. So this poem actually reveals that London wasn't really like a lot of people around the world would have been persuaded to believe. So William Blake lived in London. It was his home. It's somewhere he knew very well. And in this poem, he explores the London that he sees, what he believes to be the real London. And what Blake believed is that the Industrial Revolution and the restructuring of society that went alongside the Industrial Revolution meant that people had lost sight of what it actually meant to be human. He was frustrated, he was upset by the way that he saw the advances in science and industry actually destroying a lot of what he felt should be important to humanity, and he was deeply upset by the poverty that he saw around him, and that's exactly what he explores in this poem. So you can see now we've got a painting of William Blake, the poet, here, and also his famous collection of poems. He wasn't actually famous at the time he was alive, but this collection has become increasingly famous since, and it's called The Songs of Innocence and of Experience. And what he does in this collection of poems is he divides it into 2 sections. So he has poems that are called The Songs of Innocence, in which he talks and explores childhood, often linked to a pastoral setting. That means this idyllic countryside rural setting, and he explores the idea that all of us are born innocent, and that by the time we get to adulthood, and that's where we get to the poems of experience, that we have been corrupted by society. And what Blake believed is that there were lots of restrictions that were put upon us as humans that actually took away our ability to be truly joyful and to truly love. So let's look a little bit more about that. Blake was often called a visionary poet, and he actually described having spiritual visions, seeing things that couldn't really have been there, and being quite prophetic, as if he could see more than anyone else could actually literally see with their eyes. And he's also linked to the group of poets called the Romantics. So that meant that he shared their beliefs in the importance of childhood, in the power of our imaginations as humans, and also in the importance of our relationship with nature, and this belief that actually a lot of what human society was doing was imposing rules and values that meant that people actually behaved in a way that broke their relationship with nature, that destroyed the innocence that we're all born with. So really what I'm saying is that Blake was a bit of a rebel. He saw the church as restrictive. Whilst he was religious, he believed in the Old Testament. He felt that England was kind of the true Garden of Eden and that it would be somewhere that would return one day to being that. He actually resented the way that he felt that the church betrayed people by having too many rules and telling people how to behave. He didn't think that's really what faith should be about. He felt that the church interfered with the natural relationship between humans and God. And he felt that England had potential to become a second Jerusalem, to be this sort of holy place, and that the Industrial Revolution was destroying that. Just like he believed that the adult world was corrupting the innocence of childhood. And his poetry is all about fighting and resisting that change, those things that he felt strongly about. So he's a very political poet. He's an angry man, he's frustrated by society, and all of these things are going to help us understand what he portrays to us as he explores London in this poem. So before we go any further, I think it's important that we listen to a reading of the poem, and I always say that rather than just hear it once and then move straight on, it'd be a good idea to pause the video after you've heard one reading and then read it yourself, and read it a couple of times, because every time you read it, it's going to settle more into your mind and you're going to connect more with its meaning.
I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and marking every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney-sweepers cry, every blackening churches appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
So let's start with our title. Now this is a very straightforward title. It's the name of the city, the capital city, London, and that's exactly what this poem is about. There's no trick happening here, there's nothing cryptic to worry about, but it's very important to Blake that this poem is absolutely seen as the sort of symbol of everything that he finds dislikable, everything that he rejects about London and the city it's become. And you'll see on the left-hand side we've got this handwritten version of the poem that's surrounded with illustration. This is actually Blake himself. So as well as being a poet, he was also an illustrator, and he believed that art and literature went side by side, hand in hand. So he illustrated all of his poems, and often the illustrations add to the general feeling of the poem. And if you look at those characters at the top, I think you'll already be able to see the kind of hunched over old man and the young child. We've got this already idea of innocence, experience, youth, and an older person. And I think it's fair to say that misery is pervading that picture as well. So let's think about the structure of this poem then. We've got 4 stanzas, and each stanza, you might have noticed, is 4 lines long, and that's called a quatrain. So already we can see this is a poem that's very carefully controlled and organised, and Blake has done that because it adds to the way in which he's going to portray his ideas and organise them, and we'll unpick that as we go through. It's a poem that's like a monologue. We've got a first person speaker. So what that means is that we are listening to the personal voice and perspective of our speaker as the speaker is walking around the city. In fact, he's wandering around the city, which immediately suggests this kind of random, not particularly organised walk through the streets of the city. There is a rhyme scheme, hopefully you notice that too. If we use ABAB to describe the way in which those rhymes play out, what that rhyme scheme does, because it's so regulated, it helps with this sense of a walk. So if we think about one foot down after another foot down and the rhythm and pattern of walking through the streets, we can talk about how the structure of this poem, the rhyme and the rhythm of the poem actually reflects that idea of movement through the city. And if you look closer again at that rhyme scheme, then all the words that rhyme, pretty much all of them have got connotations of misery and pain. So we've got words like woe and fear and appall and cry and sigh. All of these words really obviously link to the misery and pain in the poem. And because they're put at the end of the lines and they're connected to the rhyme scheme, then what it does is it gives them even more strength in terms of how the poem sounds. We're hearing those words and they're being given more power by the fact that they are then used for the rhyme. So everything about this poem is designed to really hammer home this sense of misery. The first stanza really focuses on sight, what we can see, but the rest of the poem, stanzas 2, 3 and 4, absolutely grounded in the idea of sound and auditory imagery. And that's a really interesting thing about this poem, that he can not just see the misery, he can hear the misery everywhere that he turns. Now, getting a little bit technical here, and this is something that you don't need to know at this level about the poem, but for those of you who are really enjoying it and want to challenge yourselves more, then I'll just tell you a little bit as a teaser and you can go and look up more yourself. But the first 3 lines and then others in the poem are actually written in something called iambic tetrameter, which means that there's a particular rhythm, a meter, that goes through each line. So we've got those first 3 lines: I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet. Hopefully you could hear that pattern building, and that's called a meter. Well, that suddenly changes as soon as our speaker's confronted by misery, marks of weakness, marks of woe. That's different. We don't have that same rhythm there. And if, as I've said, if you want to explore that further, that's quite a complicated idea, but that's a little challenge for those of you who want to go and do more. Okay, so let's start going through each stanza and seeing what we can unpick. So here we go. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. So we've already talked a little bit that we've got this first person speaker, and like Blake, this speaker seems to be a visionary. So we've said that that's someone who can sort of see, hear more than anyone else might notice. And this speaker can see and hear pain that seems to be beneath the surface. So the visionary sense of this narrator helps us to really feel and hear that underneath what might appear to be a very successful city, there's a lot of pain and misery bubbling away. And the fact that it's a first-person narrator, that it's a first-person speaker, makes it very personal. So we get to feel and hear this personal account of what it's like to live amongst this suffering. I wander through each chartered street, wandering with no sense of direction, which you could say suggests that it doesn't matter where he walks in London. He doesn't have to plan his route to find this poverty and misery. It really is everywhere. The misery can be found and seen and heard everywhere he goes. Now we need to look at this word chartered, because hopefully you've noticed that it's repeated in those first 2 lines. The chartered suggests that something is owned, that there's control over it, that it's been rigidly mapped out. So it's a very important word because it's one of the things that Blake is arguing against, that he's resisting. He hates the feel that every street and even the River Thames has been in some way taken control of and is owned by the people who've got power in this society. If we think about a river, often in classical poetry and poetry now even, a river is a symbol of something that's freely flowing. It's linked with pastoral imagery, so this idea of kind of beautiful countryside. But actually in this poem, Blake shows that even the river, even this natural force, has become chartered, has become controlled and rigidly mapped out. So everything in the poem is already setting up this idea that there is no freedom.
In the poem London, Blake uses the terms chartered streets and chartered Thames. And the charter is this sense that we have to be given permission to be in certain streets. We have to be there by charter, that the establishment will do that. And the chartered streets are streets, for example, whereby cattle would have been brought to Smithfield Market for slaughter, and you would be allowed to have fairs or stalls or pubs or brothels along these streets. They were chartered. So all those social horrors are there almost by charter, by the government allowing them. There is a sense, as with the signing of the Declaration, that you have to negotiate everything through a sort of official bureaucracy. And it's a double city, and it's the same as the chartered MI6 building, or the chartered cameras that are watching us everywhere we go across the city. That's why Blake is so relevant, and just that single word slipped into that poem sets it up and makes it a pivot into contemporary times.
So I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. A melancholy tone, a sad tone has already been established. Gloominess, sadness is everywhere. Every face, so this word every is going to become important. In every face that he meets, with no exception, he notices marks of weakness, marks of woe. And it seems that these people are resigned to this miserable situation. He doesn't see people fighting against it. He sees this passive acceptance of living this miserable life. And the alliteration that you might have noticed is helping to emphasise the sound of misery. So we've got the W and the M being alliterated a lot, particularly in those last two lines with the M, mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So this sense that everything is marked, everything has been in some way scarred, and the sound of that repeated M gives us this idea there is no escape from this misery. Okay, so then we move into the second stanza, and this is where we shift to start this focus on the sound, on the auditory imagery in this poem. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So you can immediately see, and if you highlight in one colour, for example, all the words to do with sound throughout the poem, you'll see you get quite a lot of that one colour appearing. I also want you, though, to notice the repetition of the word every, and we've already seen that word in stanza 1 as well, and we're going to see it again in stanza 3. But here is where we have this absolute constant repetition of that word. Every cry, every man, every infant's cry, every voice, every ban. There is no escaping this word, and that's exactly what he's trying to say about living in London. There is no escaping the misery and the pain that exists there. There's no relief, there's no exception. Blake hears pain absolutely everywhere he goes, and that's a really important point. And we've got the crying of man, but we've also got the crying of infants, of children. Now remember that I talked at the beginning about Blake and his interest in the songs of innocence and experience of childhood and adulthood. Well, in describing the infant's cry of fear, he's showing us that he sees, as he walks around London, the corruption of children, the corruption of innocence. Even children, even babies, are living in fear. They're not able to enjoy a time of joy and innocence, and that is one of the main things that Blake was protesting against. So, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So we've got some really important imagery here. Now, first of all, I want to just point out a semantic field. So that means a group of words that are being used throughout the poem that have got quite a similar idea behind them. So we've got this word ban, which actually means restrictions that have been announced, but we've also got the word manacles, which means chains, so shackles to hold someone, to imprison somebody. And then earlier on we had that word chartered that we said meant ownership and control. If you put all of those words together, you can see that Blake is absolutely trying to get through to us as the reader this idea that so many things about humanity have become imprisoned and controlled and oppressed, and repeating those words and linking them really reinforces that. But what's particularly interesting in this last line is this idea of the mind-forged manacles. So some more alliteration there, hopefully you notice that. That gives auditory strength, so it gives power to this idea, mind-forged manacles, because this is one of the things that reflects Blake's anger, and to help that anger get through, he uses the alliteration because it gives strength to the voice of the speaker. So what Blake's saying here is that the root cause of this misery that he sees is actually how humanity is thinking about itself. So what we're starting to realise is that the chains that he's describing are chains that are metaphorically within people's own minds, and they're chains that don't actually physically exist but have been created by the pressures and the ideals of society that humans have put on people. So this really heavy image of a chained, the manacles that are around somebody's mind, is really giving us this idea that there's a mental enslavement. It's like people's minds have become slaves to this oppressive society that they live in. So it's a really powerful and devastating idea that these people don't even realise that their mind has been enslaved in this way, has been imprisoned. It's like an unseen stress and torture that they're going through. Okay, so we're still on sound here, and you might want to think about, if you look down the left-hand side of those lines, each line spells out here. It's an acrostic, and sound is so important in this poem. It's hard to believe that was just an accident, isn't it? So, how the chimney sweepers cry. We're back to the sound of crying again. Every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So let's just have a little think about the chimney sweeper here first of all. So a chimney sweeper, I think most people have heard of chimney sweepers at this time in history, often were children, and whether they were a child or an adult, they were the poorest people in society, because to work in a chimney, sweeping a chimney, was basically sending yourself to an early grave. It was a very dangerous occupation. It was life limiting, and children were often, who were sent up chimneys, were always poor. They were often orphans, and one of the things that Blake was really angry about is they were often orphan children who actually the church were meant to be taking responsibility for. So these children have to earn money. They have to go up these chimneys and risk their lives to do it. So to pick on chimney sweepers in this poem is exposing one of the most appalling things that Blake could see was happening to the innocent children that he felt should be kept away from all this corruption. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. What he's saying here is that the word appalls is linked to this idea of shame. He feels it's shame on those churches who should have been looking after those chimney sweepers, but instead the churches themselves are blackening. Look at that really interesting adjective there, which is obviously linked to the image of the soot from being a chimney sweep, but also has this link to something that's hellish and dark in a moral way. So he's exposing here the hypocrisy of the church, this image that the church is supposed to represent all the good in society, but actually it's a blackening church that's been shamed by what it's letting happen to these innocent children who should be being looked after.
Blake's poem London really touches on the social ills of the time, which were there too. I mean, the fact that child labour was appalling. He was very taken with the figure of the boy chimney sweep, who he sets against often a snowy backdrop, the blackness of these children covered with soot, starving, deformed, and legislation is brought in much later which points out the fact that children are being employed as young as 4, 5, 6 and are being forced to go up these very narrow flues by having fire set under their feet, being poked and prodded, and by the time they were 12 years old they were described as little weazened old men, I mean more or less thrown onto the streets. So Blake's desperately aware of that. So he's someone of enormous passions and anger, and these social ills which affect London affect him deeply and work their way into his poems as metaphors. And the other aspect would be the level of prostitution, that the city is full of women who cannot make a living in any other way. It's a really a nightmare city, a city of the rich and the poor, very much as in some ways it's going back to now. I mean, crossing London this morning to come here, I'm near the city of London. I'm stepping over dozens of rough sleepers who are on the streets at the same time as the bankers are commuting into their offices and their new glass buildings. It is that sense of a schizophrenic city of terrible social ills that Blake touches.
And then, as if that image isn't powerful enough, he introduces another sound, and this time it's the sigh of soldiers who he describes as hapless. Hapless suggests they're dying in vain. There's a sort of hopelessness about them. That's quite an unexpected adjective to use when you're describing soldiers. There's nothing heroic about these soldiers. In fact, what Blake's suggesting is that these soldiers are victims of a corrupt government, and that again reinforces this anger and bitterness with those who have power but are abusing it, because these soldiers are dying in vain. They're sighing, and their blood is running down the palace walls. Well, to pick the palace, the place that symbolises royalty and everything that's wealthy and powerful in the country, yet the walls of this palace are running with the blood of the soldiers. This very likely has a reference to the French Revolution, that Blake was very interested in the French Revolution and the idea that you could revolt against the fact that ordinary people are suffering and royalty are protected. So very likely that is a linked image there. But what's important is this sense of anger, that those in power, those who are rich, those who are wealthy, are staying protected and are unaware of what's happening around them, even though they are responsible for it. Okay, now we come to our last stanza. But most, through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. It's a powerful final stanza, and it's no accident that it starts with that word but and then most, because what Blake's saying is that he's left the most bleak, the most horrendous controversy till last. So he used the chimney sweep as this kind of terrible example of innocence, and now he describes a young prostitute. So he's covered different pockets of society all the way through. We've got the men, the soldiers, we've got the women, we've got the children, and this last image is of a child, a young prostitute. So particularly shocking that now we've got another young person, a young woman who's been forced, in order to survive, to be stripped of her innocence and to work in this dangerous, desperate situation. And again, we've got sound. Most, through the midnight streets, so hidden away at night, not something that's being proudly displayed for anyone who's looking at London from the outside, but what Blake, as the visionary, or what Blake's speaker in the poem, can hear is the youthful harlot's curse. So harlots is the prostitute. Innocence is definitely given to us through that word youthful. But what this harlot is doing is cursing. So cursing, obviously negative, the idea of not being happy, of kind of inflicting or wishing misery on something else. And then comes the shock that the curse seems to be blasting a newborn infant. Not even an innocent newborn baby is being comforted in this poem. In fact, the only time we see and hear a newborn in the poem, the newborn is crying, and that cry is being cursed. So it's a brilliant end to a poem that's generally this anger towards this miserable society, because even what should be this beautiful symbol of innocence and a little life with everything ahead of it, even that baby's life has become something that is being immediately treated with disdain. And it shows a society that's been hardened by poverty, by unfairness, and therefore is attacking everything about innocence that Blake believed in. And there are harsh and angry sounds now through the alliteration through that letter B, blasts with the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. It's a really interesting last line here. Blights and plagues, some critics have linked to sexually transmitted diseases that obviously refer to the idea of this being a prostitute and the risk that this young woman would have been living in. And it also works as a double meaning though. It's about the cursing of this prostitute linking to this surreal image at the end, this metaphor of a marriage hearse. Now, it's an oxymoron. We don't expect normally to hear the words marriage and hearse put together. You know, marriage would have been expected to be a religious union, something that was joyous, and then hearse obviously linked to a funeral, a death. So Blake very cleverly ends the poem with these two words together and this surreal image of a carriage moving love and death together through the city. What Blake's actually doing is he's attacking the institution of marriage as much as he's attacking so many other things about society. Blake felt that all the things that put pressures on people to behave in certain ways were causing problems for other people in society. And it means that the poem ends with no hope at all. This doesn't have a happy ending. There's actually a cyclical sense. That means the idea that it goes full circle, that all these people in this poem are trapped in a circle where they're never going to escape this misery. And also, could it be that Blake is exploring his fears for the future as well? It's actually a vision of the doom that we will continue to live in. He's definitely criticising humans generally for not working to create a society that's based on freedom and on love, or on the idea of innocence being joyful. So let's think about how you could compare London with other poems in the anthology. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. There are ways in which you could find comparisons with every poem in the anthology. I've just picked out some that I think are particularly interesting and fun to explore. Let's start with Ozymandias, so Shelley's poem. Whilst both poems have conclusions that are very different in their mood, they're both exploring how power can be wrongly used to damage and suppress people. And that, I think, is a really interesting way to go. And we can talk about the context of both poets and their feelings about society. And that's a really good way into comparing the way in which they put those ideas across in those two poems. And similarly, Wordsworth, in the Prelude, we've got both poems linked to that Romanticism movement, so it's not surprising that there are similar ideas. We can think about they both use a first-person speaker, and through that speaker they explore a view that humans have a misguided view of power and what they should be able to do with that power and where they fit in society and what they should be using their time for. The Charge of the Light Brigade is an interesting comparison because Tennyson has a very different motivation for using the poetic form to record suffering and conflict. He's celebrating, of course, what he sees as the bravery and heroism of those soldiers in the Charge of the Light Brigade, very differently motivated to Blake in how he chooses to record suffering and conflict. And then Exposure by Owen, we've got both poets writing really negatively about their experiences and both writing on their own real life experiences really. Neither offer any hope for the future. Both are really angry throughout their poems with the people who are in power, who could do something to change things, but don't. In Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, we've got both poets here exploring humans in danger and the fear and pain that's caused by government decisions, and then that same idea of an abuse of power. So Remains is an interesting one. Both Remains and London both explore human suffering through the individual experience of the poem's speaker. And yes, they're very different in terms of their context, but actually there are some similarities in the way that they get that trauma across, because we have got two traumatised narrators, even though it's for very different reasons. The War Photographer is a nice comparison by Duffy, because both poems are expressing anger at a situation. They're written in different centuries, they're about different experiences, but they've both got this sense of despair about human suffering and how this is sometimes ignored by society and the damage that that does. And then finally, a really nice comparison is to look at Agard's Checking Out Me History. Again, we've got really angry and bitter speakers in both of our poems here, and they're both exploring this idea of the abuse of power by institutions that have been trusted, have been given authority by society, and yet these two speakers have been absolutely devastated by how they've seen that be abused, misused. So I hope that's been helpful. You should now have an understanding of those main feelings and attitudes that Blake's expressing in this poem, London. I'm hoping you'll be able to pick out some of those ideas about the effect of language, form and structure and use those to help you really explain how Blake gets those ideas across. And finally, you should now have a bit of understanding about what London was like in the time that Blake was writing, what Blake himself believed about society, and how knowing that helps us to really get more out of this poem and explain what he's doing with greater confidence. Thanks for listening.